When people struggle with clay, their first assumption a lot of times is that the problem is with their technique. They think they're not steady enough, they're not strong enough, or not experienced enough. But more often than not, the real issue is one that comes before a technical issue. Rather, that mismatch is an understanding issue. Most likely, they're asking the clay to behave in a way that it was never designed to do. A lot of beginner problems start with mismatched expectations that are just rooted in a simple lack of understanding. So say somebody buys a clay because it was popular, or just because it was available in the store, or because they saw somebody else using it online or in person, and then they get it back to their studio and it warps, it cracks, slumps, or feels just unresponsive. Instead of questioning the material, they question themselves. In this lesson, we're going to slow things down and talk about how clay behaves and why different clay bodies feel so different, and how to choose the right clay body for your situation. That alone can remove a huge amount of frustration from the whole process. We're going to talk about the different clay types and subtypes, as well as how to identify the different qualities of clay when choosing one to buy for your own studio. This is where we learn what's actually happening and how to make informed decisions when it comes to purchasing and using your clay bodies. When we talk about clay bodies, we're not talking about a single substance. A clay body is a recipe. It's a blend of different material ingredients chosen to behave in a certain way. Until relatively recently, in terms of ceramic history, potters had to rely on what was regionally or locally available. That's why you see pottery communities form around certain geographical areas, like along the fall line in the southern eastern United States. That fall line is where the coastal plain and the upland region meet. And in those areas, you'll find the most active communities that have historically been dedicated to the creation of pottery because of its natural clay deposits, like Seagrove, North Carolina, or Edgefield and Aiken in South Carolina. These are some of the richest and naturally occurring sources of kaolin and clays in this part of the United States. Similarly, in other parts of the world, you'll have naturally occurring clays of varying qualities, and that's why potters would congregate in specific areas. Today, we're lucky because that with modern mining and refining techniques, we're able to source more pure forms of the ingredients of clay that companies across the country and world can source individually to blend into their own mixtures and create desired aesthetic and certain properties for particular purposes. Some clay bodies are designed to stretch easy. Others are designed to hold their structure better than others. Some clays dry quicker, some more slowly, and some shrink a lot. Some clays barely move. All these different kinds of clays are made to fire at different temperatures or for very specific purposes too. Once you understand that every clay has an intended purpose, you can find the type that'll work best for what you want and stop forcing it to do things it wasn't made to do. All right, so let's talk about some of the qualities of clay you'll look for when choosing one for your own uses. I know we've discussed it before, but one of the most important qualities of a clay used for pottery is its plasticity. Plasticity describes how easily clay can stretch and move without cracking. Highly plastic clays feel more smooth and responsive to your touch, and a good workable clay can really be rolled into a coil and wrapped around your finger without breaking or cracking. However, there's a line where a clay can be too plastic. Really plastic clays are often easier to center on the wheel, but they can slump if you're pushed too far or overwatered. Less plastic clays feel stiffer and are more resistant to forming. They might hold their edge well, but they don't like being stretched quickly or too far. And neither one is better than the other, they're just built for different kinds of work. When we're talking about plasticity though, it's not something that you're going to find described that's quantified on a bag or a box of clay. It's just something to be aware of when describing a clay or its properties. The descriptor that is used to describe a clay being less plastic is short. If you hear someone refer to a clay as short, it doesn't mean anything about its height. It means the clay is less likely to bend or shape without cracking. So the other major factor when choosing a clay that you want to pick for your own studio is shrinkage. All clay shrinks as it dries and fires. Shrinkage happens because water leaves the clay and those particles move closer together. The more water a clay holds and the finer its particles, the more it's going to tend to shrink. On a box of clay or on an online listing, this is referred to as shrinkage rate, and it refers to the amount a clay body will physically shrink between its wet, out of the bag form and the size it ultimately becomes when fired to maturity. It'll be represented as a percentage, and ranges of 8 to 14% are really normal and to be expected. Typically, a finer particle clay and higher firing clays will shrink more. Porcelains, for example, have the highest shrinkage rates, around 12 to 14%, while like earthenware bodies will shrink a lot less. Cracks usually aren't caused by bad construction technique. They're caused by uneven shrinkage during drying or firing. And one part of a piece that dries faster than the other, that'll cause clay to tear itself as it's trying to compensate for the different shrinkage rate. This can happen most where clay joins, like a handle on a mug, but also in the bottom where clay is drying on a bat or a wearboard. Understanding shrinkage lets you predict problems before they happen instead of reacting after they do. Let's talk some more about absorption too. This is what fired clay does with water. One of the most important things to understand about clay, especially if you're making functional work, is absorption. That term describes how much water a fired clay body can take in after it's been through the kiln. Some clays after firing remain really porous. That means water can still move into the clay body of the pot, and that can be really helpful for like planters, pipes, and roof tiles made from earthenware or other terracottas. Other clays, like porcelain, fire so dense that it barely absorbs anything at all. This matters a lot more than people realize because a clay with higher absorption can feel lighter and more open, and sometimes more forgiving during making, but after firing, it might not be suitable for holding liquids unless it's fully glazed, even on the bottoms of the pieces. If water can soak into the clay, it can weaken the piece over time, it can stain the surface, or cause problems with durability. Lower absorption clays are denser and stronger once they're fired, and they're typically better for functional wear because they resist water and wear. This is why firing temperatures matter so much, and absorption isn't about the clay body itself, it's about whether it's been fired to the temperature the clay was designed to. When a pot leaks, when it stains, or it feels fragile after firing, it's often an absorption issue, not a forming one. Understanding absorption helps you connect material choice, firing temperature, and function into a single decision instead of guessing about it after it's already done. A good range for functional wear is about 1.5% or lower. Any more than 2% absorption, and you start having the chance of your clay body absorbing water over time. And those absorption rates are also important to be mindful of for functional pots, because those pottery that has a higher absorption rate will take in water through exposed areas, often on the bottom, and that water can be superheated, say like a microwave, making a piece really hot to touch when it comes out. All right, now vitrification. This is what happens when a clay reaches its maturity in the kiln. As a clay body is fired hotter and hotter, its particles will begin to fuse together. At the right temperature, the clay particles partially melt and it forms a dense glass-like structure. This is what gives fired pottery its strength and its durability. A vitrified clay body is no longer just dry earth, it is fully formed ceramic. And if a clay is fired below its vitrification range, it remains porous and weak. If it fired above that range, it can get too glassy and stick to the shelf. It can slump or warp or even begin to melt into other areas of the kiln. That narrow window becomes where the clay is strongest but still holds its shape is called its maturity range. This is why cone ratings exist. The cones aren't arbitrary, they're a way of measuring and matching a clay body to the amount of heat it needs to fully mature. You don't need to master firing science to understand this, you just need to know that a clay wants to be fired to a very specific point. On a box or a website listing, you'll see a clay's firing point represented in cones. And like we defined before, cones are the term that's used to describe the heat work, which is that temperature and time together. In this episode's resource section, you'll find an example of a cone chart. Since we'll be using this language and talking about target cone temps over and over throughout this course, and since it pervades all conversations around ceramic materials and processes, you really need to get familiar with it. Okay, these have been the main qualities you'll need to know about clay and how to choose one that works best for you. You can find most of these qualities represented on boxes of clay or listed on clay sellers or the manufacturer's websites in the description of the clay body itself. They're essential to help you understand why a clay behaves the way it does and how to choose one that works best for your needs. Now, when you go to choose a clay, or a glaze for that matter, almost all of them are broken down into three main categories that are qualified by the temperature they mature at. Those categories are low fire, mid-range, and high fire. Low fire often describes a clay or glaze that matures under cone 1. Most often, these are earthenwares and glazes for earthenware ceramics. Mid-range is the largest category, and it's where most potters and ceramics make and live today. This is due primarily to the advent and popularity of home electric kilns and synthetic ceramic materials that reduced firing temperature without compromising density or strength. Mid-range refers to materials that mature at cone 1 through cone 7. Some earthenware clays can cross into the mid-range category, and many stoneware clays and glazes for them are often in this category as well. Due to those material advances that we talked about, even some porcelains can now be fired at this range and achieve their unique translucency here. Mid-range clay and glazes are the most accessible, and they're a balanced option that boast fired strength at a relatively energy-efficient temperature. Now, when we talk about high fire, this is the category that describes everything which matures over cone 8 and beyond, although cone 10 is most common. Before electric kilns and synthetic ceramic materials, this was the firing range that was needed to achieve pottery and ceramic objects that were fired to a maturity level that really provided a lot of strength and durability. Specifically, designed atmospheric kilns fueled with like wood, gas, or oil were needed to achieve these really hot temperatures. And higher grade stonewares and like true porcelains are in this category. So now that we've talked about them in brief, let's talk about the main clay categories you'll encounter within those firing ranges, which are earthenware, stoneware, and porcelain. All right, guys, so we've laid out some examples of earthenware and want to talk about them in more detail, because earthenware is one of the oldest types of clay used by humans. It fires at a lot lower temperatures, like cone 08 to cone 1, and it remains really porous after firing. It's soft, it's responsive, it's easy to shape, and really accessible to many clay applications due to its lower energy requirements to reach maturity. Say, for example, you're a caveman making a pot to serve food out of for your tribe. You can fire it in an open fire, and it gets hard and usable. But because of its lower firing temperature, it's still really porous. It's not very dense, and it does tend to absorb more water. So earthenware is not best to use to create strong pottery that can withstand a lot of heavy usage. Rather, it's a great option to use commercially for things like culverts, chimneys, planters, pipes, and roofing tiles. However, people will use earthenware for pottery purposes, but they'll need to be glazed on the bottom with the aid of special kiln stilts in order to reduce the amount of water that the pot absorbs. So the glaze is acting in a way as the sealer, where higher fired clay will seal itself. Earthenware is typically categorized into two color options. You've got white and red. White earthenware is commonly used for decorative work and really bright surface decoration. And in the past, that was because a lot of color tends to dull after a certain temperature, where you could really get those bright popping colors if you were to fire lower. Red earthenware contains a lot more iron, and it has a warmer, earthier color, which connects people directly towards a lot of historical pottery traditions and connotations. Earthenware is approachable, and it's expressive, and it's used both in functional and more commercial applications. But you just have to keep in mind that when using it for functional work, glaze is going to play a major role in sealing the surface, whereas in higher firing clays, it will seal itself. Okay, we've set the table so that we can talk about stoneware. Stoneware is one of the most common clay categories for functional pottery. It fires at mid to high temperatures, typically cone 1 to cone 7. Though stoneware can also be described as clays firing hotter to cone 10 and 12. It becomes much denser and stronger than earthenware when fired correctly. Stoneware also is going to come in several different subcategories, each with its own personality and aesthetic characteristics. Like a white stoneware is bright, it's really neutral and versatile. It provides a clean surface for glazes to really pop and shine on. And even though it's called white, it's typically in a fire like a creamy off-white or gray color. Whereas something like a red stoneware is going to have a lot of iron in it, and it's going to be warmer in tone. These can range from like orange to brown, but it's going to provide that rich surface that's really satisfyingly earthy, like the terracottas, but it's going to fire hotter, so it's still going to have the qualities of stoneware. Red clays can affect the surfaces of glazes. Iron can sometimes break down in firings, causing a lot of gassing. So this can sometimes create pinholes in your glaze surfaces or in really heavily iron-bearing bodies, sometimes even bloating, which are little like air pockets that begin to form inside the piece. But if handled properly, red stoneware is a wonderfully warm option for many potters today to choose for their wares. So the iron content in red clays can really affect the surfaces of a lot of glazes. Iron can break down in the kiln firings, which causes gassing. This can create pinholes in glaze surfaces for lightly contained iron bodies, or in more heavily bearing iron bodies. Sometimes if they're overfired, that gas can really create bubbles inside of a clay that's called bloating. But if handled properly, red stoneware is a wonderfully warm option that many potters choose today to create their wares. All right, buff stoneware. This is gonna sit somewhere in between white and red. It's gonna have like a softer tan coloration that brings a lot of warmth without being too overpowering or containing too much iron. Then you're gonna have options that are like speckled stonewares. These can be both brown and white, and these little speckles will show through the glazes and are often made of like coarse ground manganese that creates a lot of visual texture. All right, so let's talk about darker bearing clays. I don't have a fired example of one here, but this is an example of one in its raw form. Dark stonewares, these can appear sometimes even black. It's going to contain a lot of iron to get this color, or sometimes even manganese to be able to drive the clay body to be this dark. And it's going to have deep and rich and sometimes really, really black body color. This can dramatically influence a glaze appearance, and so you should be aware of that when choosing one. For example, in a clear or a celadon glaze, a dark clay body like this can almost like suck out all of the color or leave it a little bit milky or cloudy, where as with some more like matte glazes, it can just mute it a little bit, which can be really desirable if that's the aesthetic you're after. And that's where a lot of these glazes are often chosen, is their aesthetic appearance rather than their like ease of use, because a lot of people just sometimes have mismatched expectations when using a dark stoneware. Because of that, it just can pull the color out of a glaze. And if you're looking at a label that shows a color of a glaze and then you put it on a dark clay body expecting to get that, just know it can be a little different than you expect. Overall, stoneware is really durable, it's adaptable, and an excellent choice for beginners because it balances that plasticity we need, a fired strength, and material forgiveness. Plus, it's readily fireable to the temperatures most potters can achieve in home studio electric kilns. All right, now we're going to talk about porcelain. This is the most refined clay category of them all. It's made of extremely fine clay and kaolin particles, and it's going to fire to a really dense, glassy surface that can sometimes really even be translucent. For example, I'll show you what I mean by that. I have before me some porcelain pieces that I've made, and here's a very bright flashlight. You can kind of see how the light can just like pass right through the material in a way that makes it really satisfying. It's also a really cool demonstration to show people about what porcelain can do. But porcelain is really honest. It's going to show every inconsistency in thickness, every rush decision, every moment of inattention. It's a lot less forgiving than other clays and often is more challenging to work with. It does stretch really easily if you're working it, but that also means it can collapse if it's really overworked or oversaturated with water. It's also going to shrink a lot more than other clays and demands really careful attention during drying, especially when adding attachments like handles or like lid knobs or spouts. It's not a clay that forgives rushing, but it does teach a lot of discipline, and almost better than any of the other ceramic material. Porcelain is a really beautiful material to work with and produces some of the finest wares that people have made throughout the ages, but it does come with a level of challenge that I probably wouldn't recommend for beginners. But if you are advanced or you're getting into exploring different material options, porcelain can be a great thing to play around with to kind of push your boundaries of what you're comfortable with. Another factor you'll encounter when choosing clays is something called grog. Grog is pre-fired and crushed ceramic material that's added back into a clay body. It does a couple different things. It's going to help reduce shrinkage. It's going to improve a clay's drying ability, and it's going to add strength and help thermal shock resistance. Clay with grog feels more textured, almost like there's sand in the clay, because kind of there is. And that helps a clay body hold its shape better, making it an excellent option for people who are hand building, raku firing, or making really large or sculptural forms. Whereas clay without grog, something like porcelain, is going to feel really smooth, and smooth clay can often be preferable for wheel throwing, but it does make it more sensitive during the drying process. Again, none of this is about what's better or worse. It's about choosing the right material for the job. It's also worth mentioning that each of these clay categories can be available in a liquid version called slip, used in something called a casting process. Casting slip is available as all of these options, as earthenware, stoneware, or porcelain. And that slip is going to contain the same basic ingredients as their other moist clay counterparts. However, those ingredients are mixed with a lot more water and have been what's called deflocculated, which means helped keep those particles in suspension. And what that does is help reduce the clay particles from settling and plating down to the bottom of a bag or a bucket. That deflocculation material is kind of like a repellent for clay particles, keeping everything in suspension. Slip is then poured into plaster molds that retain the moisture, leaving the clay stuck to the plaster walls, and then the molds are broken apart, leaving a formed ceramic piece in the middle. For beginners, like where we're starting at today, if you're new to pottery or just want something stable, the best clay option is usually one that's forgiving, mid-range, and really versatile. A moderately plastic white stoneware with some grog for structure is a great place to start. Especially as your skills grow, your clay choices will evolve alongside them. The goal right now isn't to find the perfect clay. The goal is to find a clay that supports where you are right now. And if you're new, I highly recommend picking a white stoneware that's commonly available and widely tested by other potters. A great choice for this is something like B-Mix from Laguna Clay, or White Bear and Iceman by Kentucky Mudworks. All of these are well tested. They're reliable white stonewares with plenty of documented fired results to use as a reference guide or inspiration. It might be tempting to try to find a clay that no one else is using at the moment, but truthfully, that can often make your life a little bit more challenging because there's less documented results of what those clay bodies look like with the spectrum of glazes that are available. And you're going to have to do all the research and documentation to find out what works with that clay. So that's why I like to recommend just a really simple, stable, widely accessible white stoneware. If you're in the US and you need a reliable place to source clay, I really would recommend Clay King. They carry a wide range of clays that you can pick from, and they ship really quickly, so you're never going to be waiting too long to receive your orders. And that really helps you continue on in your projects so that you're not waiting on the things that you want to create. They organize their clay sections also really easily, so you're able to find and get reliable quantities. You can even get 4-pound samples so that you can try a clay body before you commit to ordering 100 pounds of it, and then you're stuck with the clay that maybe you don't love as much as you thought you would. Guys, that was a lot of information, but I hope it serves as a really good foundation so that you can help develop your ceramic experience and understanding. When you're ready, I'll see you in the next episode.